When a child disappears, ordinary lives are suddenly cast into searchlights, and the people closest to the story become the story itself. Robin Lane's position in Summer Wells's life was not accidental, it was structural. She was more than a face in a classroom roster or a name on a church bulletin. She was present in routines, in greetings exchanged between child and teacher, and in the small daily gestures that stitch a community together. That proximity matters because it creates two things at once: deep, contextual knowledge and heightened visibility. From an analytical standpoint, someone who spends repeated, structured time with a child will naturally accumulate details about moods, habits, and patterns. The tragedy of a disappearance transforms those accumulated details into a public ledger: what the adult knew, what she did, and when she was seen. In Lane's case, reports of spontaneous hugs, of a teacher who knew Summer's little preferences and who was a steady presence at church and Sabbath school, turned what would otherwise be everyday warmth into evidence of intimate knowledge. That familiarity is crucial for two reasons. First, it produces potentially useful information: who the child trusts, what routines she follows, who regularly interacts with her. Second, and less obviously, it focuses public attention on the adult's every move. When grief and anxiety tighten across a community, attention becomes a kind of currency. The more visible you are, the more your actions are parsed for meaning. Lane's closeness also demonstrates the dual nature of witness testimony. In private settings, she observed tenderness and raw grief that stark camera interviews might not capture, small, human moments that complicated the more curated public presentation of the family. Those private glimpses humanized parents for some observers and, for others, raised questions about selective interpretation. Being close allows you to testify in ways strangers cannot, but it also invites skepticism because your proximity can be perceived as a source of bias. In short, the same intimacy that yields insight also complicates interpretation. As the community sought answers, Lane's relationship with Summer became both a resource for understanding and an unavoidable focal point for scrutiny. Her readiness to act, grabbing flashlights, organizing volunteers, mapping meeting places, read outward as competence. To many, that competence was a relief. Here was someone who could turn grief into structure and coordinate help. But competence carries optics. The skills that make someone an effective organizer can also make them conspicuous in ways that provoke questions during uncertain times. The consequence is that proximity plus leadership turns a private caregiver into a public figure, and once the streetlights of public attention fall on someone, every gesture becomes available for interpretation. When a community's need for answers outpaces official communication, the most visible figures naturally fill the void. Lane's visibility, then, is both a reflection of her role and a mirror of the community's hunger for narrative. That mirror does not reflect neutrally. It shows what people want to see or fear, and in moments like these the reflection can be both consoling and corrosive. Her actions in the hours after Summer's disappearance moved quickly from private helping to public coordinating. Volunteer groups needed meeting points, organizers needed checklists, and families needed practical guidance for search efforts. Lane stepped into these practical needs with methodical solutions, compiling supplies, arranging search routes, notifying volunteers, and keeping basic logistical lines moving. Those behaviors are the textbook response of someone accustomed to structure and community organizing. They are also the behaviors communities crave when panic threatens to rattle coordination. Taken purely at face value, her initiative demonstrates situational awareness and an ability to act under pressure. It helps convert chaos into usable information and brings resources to bear when minutes matter. Yet the same structure that made her effective inevitably caught scrutiny. Normal organizational acts, setting meeting points, arranging schedules, handing out flashlights, are mundane in routine contexts. In a crisis, they are magnified. People ask themselves, why was she prepared? How did she know what to do? Those questions reveal how quickly ordinary competence is reinterpreted when wrapped in alarm. In environments where official updates are sparse, observers often seek meaning in who acts decisively and who appears to have access to knowledge. Lane's preparedness, therefore, became a double-edged sword. For supporters, it was leadership. For skeptics, it suggested unusual access or pre-knowledge. Her organizational competence also shaped the community's resilience. By creating predictable frameworks for searches and vigils, she reduced uncertainty for participants, making it easier for volunteers to contribute effectively. The value of that structure is tangible. It keeps people safe, ensures resources are used efficiently, and maintains continuity in a prolonged search. But organization also creates a central point of contact, and centrality draws attention. In short, her practical skills were indispensable, and those same skills made her conspicuous. That conspicuousness is precisely where public perception split. In emotionally charged contexts, observers interpret identical actions in opposite ways. Equal measures of admiration and suspicion settle on the same set of behaviors. Lane's visible competence reassured many people and galvanized participation. For others, it served as a focal point for doubt. This divergence makes clear a recurring truth in public crises. The very actions that enable a community to respond well, decisiveness, planning, visibility, also expose actors to intensified scrutiny. The community's reaction to visible action often depends on narrative needs as much as on facts. Where official channels fail to fill the informational void, the community builds a narrative out of what it can observe. Lane's coordination supplied narrative pieces, dates, places, faces, that others used to stitch their own interpretations together. The result intensified both the effectiveness of community response and the heat of interpretive debate. This is why the boundary between helpfulness and suspicion is so thin. When someone steps forward and acts efficiently during crisis, their behavior addresses immediate needs and satisfies the community's desire for agency. But in doing so, they expose themselves to narrative scrutiny precisely because people are looking for patterns, for causes, and for someone who can make sense of the mess. Lane's organization gave people a way to act. It also gave them a person to question. Public perception split into admiration and suspicion almost as soon as visible leadership emerged. The admiration was straightforward. People needed direction, and when one of their own supplied it, they credited her with compassion and capability. The suspicion, conversely, operated on different currents. It drew on the timing, frequency, and intensity of Lane's public involvement. Observers began to ask whether her consistent presence was a sign of dedication or an overstep. This binary response, praise from some, skepticism from others, reflects a broader social psychology at work. In moments of uncertainty, communities build stories to make sense of their fear, and those stories often require both heroes and suspects. Skepticism was amplified by the ambiguous line between official and unofficial roles. When official statements were few, unofficial voices filled the vacuum. Lane's clarifying statement about the red pickup, for example, provided certainty to some and provoked suspicion in others. People wondered, how did she come by that information? Was she connected to investigative channels, or was she rounding up fragments of rumor and passing them off as clarity? The answer mattered less than the perception. The mere fact that an unofficial actor had authoritative-sounding information created friction. Social media multiplied every gesture. Each photograph, comment, and account became fuel for interpretation, and repetition in online spaces made certain narratives feel more plausible simply because they were repeated. Supporters framed Lane as a pillar who mobilized a grieving town. Detractors read the same actions as signs of unusual closeness that needed explanation. In short, public perception did not just reflect what happened. It remade it into competing narratives that the community could use to manage its fear. This paradox, responsible action that invites suspicion, is not unique to this case. It is a predictable human pattern. When outcomes are unknown, people look for proximate causes and agents to attach responsibility to. Visible actors become natural targets for this process simply because their presence supplies the required material for narrative construction. Lane's case is a vivid example. Proximity and action produced both valuable contributions and unavoidable interpretive risk. Small decisions about visibility thus have outsized consequences. The same hands that handed out flashlights and organized volunteers also handed the public a script to read and criticize. In moments of grief and confusion, every practical gesture participates in a public conversation about intention and responsibility. For Lane, the consequence was unavoidable. Her commitment helped bring structure to a chaotic moment, and that very commitment made her central to the community's debate about what happened and why. Unofficial communication, the kind that falls outside police releases or formal press statements, plays a powerful role when official channels are quiet. That dynamic surfaced dramatically in the case of a red Toyota pickup. Official investigators ultimately ruled that the vehicle was not connected to the disappearance, but not before the community had circulated rumors, tips, and competing accounts. When Lane spoke to confirm that authorities had ruled that vehicle out, her statement functioned as a stopgap. It corrected rumor, eased confusion for some, and became another piece of the public narrative. The problem is that unofficial clarifications, even when accurate, blur lines. Communities expect updates to come through designated channels for several reasons. Official channels have protocols, they protect investigative integrity, and they carry institutional credibility. When a community leader or well-connected volunteer relays similar information, listeners must decide whether to treat it as insider knowledge or as second-hand interpretation. Lane's clarification therefore raised two questions simultaneously. Was she accurately relaying what law enforcement had concluded, and did her ability to relay that information imply access to investigative processes beyond that of a typical community member? The answer to either question can be damaging or exculpatory depending on how it is framed. The effect of an unofficial voice filling a communication vacuum is twofold. Practically, such voices can help reduce rumor and focus energies. People who could have chased false leads were steered away from the red pickup after the clarification. Emotionally, that voice can provide comfort in a chaotic time. Someone is paying attention and clearing up confusion. But symbolically, it can generate suspicion. Observers may infer that the speaker has privileged access or undue influence. Equally plausible, they might assume the speaker is mistaken but pressing a narrative. Once suspicion is introduced, it can be amplified by social media and repeated commentary, leading to a feedback loop where the act of clarifying both solves a problem and creates a new one. That loop becomes especially potent when the person providing unofficial updates is already highly visible. A community leader who organizes vigils and coordinates volunteers and then provides what sounds like investigative news becomes difficult to categorize. Is she a conduit for reliable information, an advocate relaying what she hears, or someone who has crossed the boundary into quasi-official authority? The community's answer often reflects its broader emotional state more than any objective measure of access. In short, when institutional updates lag, unofficial voices rush to fill gaps, and their helpfulness is inseparable from the interpretive cost they bear. Two other figures quickly moved into the public gaze for different reasons: David Dodson and Tim Mullins. Their trajectories in the public imagination show how symbolic associations and perceived influence shape suspicion even in the absence of concrete evidence. Dodson's profile carried symbolic weight. As someone connected to the funeral industry, his normal and professional associations touched on themes of mortality that are especially potent when a child is missing. In communities under stress, symbolic cues like occupational imagery can be amplified out of all proportion to their factual relevance. Dodson's background did not prove anything. It simply provided a cognitive shortcut for observers trying to reconcile fear with pattern. When a person associated with death-related professions reduces their public presence at a tense moment, observers often fill the silence with speculation. Why leave? Did he know something? Was his withdrawal suspicious or simply private? Symbolic resonance, the way certain images trigger associative meaning, does the heavy lifting in these moments, and Dodson's professional identity provided exactly that. Tim Mullins's public profile presented a different vector of concern. He was perceived by some as a figure involved in coordinating public messaging around the family. In the age of fast information and reputation management, anyone who appears to control or influence narrative becomes a magnet for questions about motive and manipulation. Whether Mullins had any improper role is secondary to the human tendency to suspect handlers when a story is unfolding. Communication intermediaries often become suspicious because narrative control implies power. If you can shape what other people think they saw or heard, you wield influence, and the public tends to attribute influence to intentionality. Taken together, Dodson and Mullins demonstrate how suspicion spreads along complementary lines. Dodson's symbolic association with death provided thematic fuel. Mullins's perceived role in messaging supplied a mechanism for how narratives might be controlled. Both patterns, symbolic association and narrative control, converge around the same human urge to find a cause and assign responsibility in the face of alarming uncertainty. Media and online discussion accelerated these interpretive tendencies. When people encounter a professional identity or a perceived messaging role on social feeds, those cues are repeated and reshaped. Repetition increases the sense of certainty, and certainty breeds rumor consolidation. The result is a dynamic where patterns can look rational even when they are built on coincidence and associative inference rather than on direct evidence. This cluster of attention shows a broader phenomenon. Suspicion does not always follow lines of hard evidence. It follows lines of proximity, timing, role visibility, and symbolic resonance. Communities looking for explanations instinctively combine these threads into stories that feel coherent because they appeal to familiar archetypes: the caregiver, the silent newcomer, the narrative handler. Dodson and Mullins occupied archetypal positions that made them easy to integrate into emergent stories, even as the facts remained thin. Private grief complicates public reading of behavior in ways that are often overlooked. Public appearances, a composed statement for cameras, a measured interview, rarely capture the private moments that reveal the depth of sorrow. Lane's testimony about witnessing private breakdowns and small, unguarded moments with the family changed the texture of the public narrative for those who heard it. Candace's breakdown in a car, Dawn's grief visible in a gaze rather than a show of tears, those are the kinds of observations that complicate quick judgments. The distinction between public composure and private collapse is crucial. Public interviews are constrained by awareness, logistics, and the performative demands of media. They are not windows into the full emotional landscape. Private moments, by contrast, are raw and contextually rich. When someone like Lane recounts such moments, she offers a counterpoint to readings built solely on televised appearances. For many, that counterpoint humanizes parents who might otherwise be judged as distant or detached. For others, testimony from a close associate can be read as counsel that masks inconvenient facts. This tension reveals how incomplete evidence can distort interpretation. Observers who rely only on visible cues risk mistaking reserve for indifference. Those who privilege a close witness run the risk of taking a selectively framed testimony as comprehensive. Both errors are common in high-stakes cases. The solution is not simple. Private testimony enriches understanding, but it must be considered within its relational context and potential biases. Proximity provides insight and potential partiality in the same breath. The pattern of private observation also shows why narrative framing matters. Lane's detailed, sincere accounts carried emotional weight precisely because they were textured and relational. Yet context matters. Testimony that humanizes can also be read as advocacy. That dual effect explains why some listeners found her accounts reassuring and others saw them as protective spin. In short, private grief moments deepen understanding but do not eliminate the need for careful evaluation. If there is a through line to what unfolded and to how communities react to alarm, it is the way human cognitive shortcuts, symbolic cues, and fragmented information combine to produce powerful narratives. People use heuristics to simplify complexity. Availability makes vivid details seem more causally important. Representativeness pushes observers to match behavior to archetypes. The result is a pattern-seeking machine that prefers story coherence over probabilistic nuance. Media plays a central, catalytic role in that machine. When journalists or social posts highlight particular figures, those figures gain interpretive weight. Repetition across platforms increases perceived plausibility, and the public's desire for explanation makes even weak associations feel substantial. This is not to blame journalism wholesale. Reporting fills necessary informational needs, but it is to note that the interplay of media and emotion skews the kinds of stories that gain traction. A teacher who organizes vigils and posts a musical tribute is not just an actor in a local drama. She becomes a symbol in a narrative the media helps to shape. The strategic use of music and visuals further intensifies emotional engagement. Lane's musical tribute and accompanying images of Summer did more than memorialize. They made the child's absence immediate for people who were not physically present. Multisensory stimuli, sound paired with image, strengthen associative memory and galvanize empathy. That galvanization is useful. It keeps attention on unresolved harm and mobilizes volunteers. But it also makes individuals central to the emotional narrative in ways that invite both gratitude and suspicion. Ultimately, the story leaves us with hard lessons. Visibility can be life-saving and leadership-generating. It can also be a magnet for narrative doubt. Symbolic associations, jobs, sudden withdrawal, perceived control over messaging will always be easier for communities to latch on to than long, inconclusive investigative processes. Private testimony will offer texture and nuance but cannot substitute for transparent, authoritative updates. In the absence of official clarity, unofficial voices will speak, and their statements will be parsed for motive as much as content. What remains essential is perspective, to value the practical help that close, organized community leaders provide while recognizing the limits of inference when evidence is partial. Communities need both the empathy of personal testimony and the discipline of careful evaluation. Media and leaders alike carry responsibility to report and guide without conflating visibility with guilt, and to understand that the narratives we build in the dark can either illuminate truth or cast misleading shadows.